Close your eyes, let your shoulders drop, and take a soft, slow breath. You're about to drift back far back to a world long before hot showers, toothpaste, or fragrant soaps. Back to a time when people washed with water drawn from wells. When castles echoed with the crackling of firewood instead of running taps. And when the meaning of clean was indifferent. This is the story of medieval hygiene, not just how people cleaned themselves, but how they thought about cleanliness, health, and the body. It's not all as unpleasant as you might expect. Some things may even surprise you with their gentle logic. Others may make you grateful for your cozy bed, warm bath, and toothbrush by your side. Let this book take you by the hand and gently lead you through muddy streets, perfumed chambers, herbal bathhouses, and the quiet, candlelit corners of medieval life. You won't need armor, just curiosity and a pillow beneath your head. Ready? The Middle Ages await. Baths in a time before plumbing. Imagine a world without bathtubs lined with porcelain or the twist of a hot water faucet. In medieval times, bathing was a process, a ritual even prepared with effort and purpose. A wooden tub would be carried out, sometimes placed near a hearth to warm the bather. Water had to be fetched by hand, heated in large kettles over open flames, and poured carefully into the tub until it was just warm enough. For those who lived in towns or near monasteries, there were public bathhouses, steam-filled, wooden-walled sanctuaries where people could soak, talk, or rest in silence. These were not just places to cleanse the body, but to restore the soul. Lavender might be added to the water. Music sometimes floated through the heavy air. Of course, not everyone bathed often. Many believed that too much washing could weaken the body or let disease in through the pores. Clean linen and brushing off dirt were often favored over full immersion. A good rub with a rough cloth, scented with rosewater if you could afford it, was common among the wealthy. And while the poor had less access to regular washing, they too knew the feeling of rinsing sore feet in cold streams, or wiping sweat with a piece of clean cloth after a day's work. It wasn't always glamorous, but it was part of life, a balance between practicality and tradition. So the next time you turn the tap and warm water runs, think of the quiet moments of those long ago, lowering themselves into steaming wooden tubs lit by candlelight. Tooth powder and breath of spice. There were no plastic toothbrushes, no tubes of minty paste, but people still cared for their teeth. In fact, medieval texts offer surprising advice on dental hygiene. Wealthy households might mix salt, crushed herbs, or even burn bread crusts into powders for brushing. These powders were often applied with cloth, rubbed gently across the teeth to remove food and freshen breath. The poor might chew on sticks or fibrous roots to clean their teeth. Licorice root, soft and sweet, was favored not just for its taste but for the way it rubbed against the enamel. Some even chewed parsley or cloves to improve the scent of their breath. Toothaches, however, were dreaded. There were no reliable dentists, only folk remedies, prayers, or in more desperate cases, extraction by a barber surgeon with iron tongs. But many people, even peasants, kept their teeth surprisingly well. A diet low in sugar and high in coarse bread, vegetables, and cheese helped reduce decay. And it was not uncommon for people to wash their mouths with wine or vinegar diluted with water, both acidic enough to help with bacteria, if used carefully. So while medieval mouths may not have sparkled like pearls, they were cared for in their own quiet way. Through crushed mint, ground charcoal, and the rinse of cold water, a kind of rhythm emerged, a different kind of clean clothes and the art of staying fresh. Cleanliness wasn't always about skin. In fact, in many parts of medieval Europe, a clean shirt was considered more important than a clean body. Linen was the secret weapon. It was worn next to the skin, beneath wool or leather garments, and changed regularly by those who could afford it. Linen absorbed sweat and body oils, and since it could be washed and bleached in the sun, it served as a kind of second skin. Laundry days were major affairs. Clothes were soaked in streams, scrubbed with ash soap, beaten against stones or wooden boards. In towns, washerwomen gathered along riverbanks, their laughter echoing as the fabric snapped in the wind. Perfume wasn't just for nobles. Simple scents made from lavender, rose petals, or herbs steeped in oils were used to mask odors. People carried scented pouches or wore garlands of herbs around their necks. Barbers didn't just cut hair, They trimmed beards, cleaned ears, picked fleas, and even gave a type of massage or grooming. Their shops were miniature hygiene centers, buzzing with conversation and the scrape of razors. Even in monasteries, where silence ruled, monks took special care to wash their hands before prayer and to keep their robes aired and clean. Cleanliness was next to godliness, and linen, and discipline were part of spiritual hygiene. So while there may have smelled of hearth smoke and the roads were dusty, there was care beneath the layers, care stitched into linen seams, stirred in durable rinse bowls, and poured from copper kettles on washing day. Water, wells, and the ritual of washing. Water was precious. It wasn't just something that flowed easily from pipes or fountains. It had to be gathered bucket by bucket from wells, rivers, or springs. And the act of fetching water was often a morning ritual, done in silence or soft chatter as the sun rose and mist curled around rooftops. In cities, wells stood in courtyards or in public squares. The creak of the winch, the splash of the bucket, the cold of the rope in one's hands, it was all part of the daily rhythm. Children helped. Neighbors nodded in greeting, and every drop brought home had value. People washed their hands and faces with cold water before meals. A bowl and a cloth by the door was a familiar sight, especially in monasteries or noble halls. Washing hands was a sign of respect, of discipline, of grace. Though full-body washing was rare for many, the small rituals of rinsing, dabbing, wiping with damp cloths, or even using snow in winter were practiced often in warm weather. Some bathed in rivers, quiet places at dawn, where ripples danced and birds sang from reeds. To live in the medieval world was to live in closeness with water. You didn't waste it. You respected it. And even a single basin could offer a moment of peace, of renewal, of care. Hair, combs, and the fight against lice. Hair was not left to grow wild. It was brushed, oiled, braided, and sometimes shaved. For many, combing the hair was a daily practice, quiet and soothing. Like a small ceremony, wooden combs, carved with care, were passed down through families or sold at markets. A good comb had fine teeth thin enough to catch not only tangles, but lice. Lice were a part of life for many. No one was ashamed. Instead, they combed carefully, using vinegar rinses or herbs to soothe the scalp. Lavender, rosemary, and even garlic found their way into scalp remedies. Monks often shaved their heads in a ring called a tonsure. It was partly spiritual, but also practical. It made grooming easier and discouraged lice. Noble ladies braided their hair tightly, sometimes hiding it beneath linen caps or silk veils scented with herbs. Oils from nuts or animal fats were used to soften the hair. Ashes from certain woods, when mixed with water, acted as a kind of shampoo. Though the results were modest by today's standards, they were thoughtful and rooted in tradition. And when someone sat to have their hair combed, it was a moment of closeness. Mother and daughter, wife and husband, friends around a fire, gentle hands working through strands. The soft sound of wood teeth passing through hair, and a sigh of comfort in the stillness of evening. The privy, the chamber pot, and the backyard pit. Nature's call came, even in castles. But toilets, as we know them, did not exist. Instead, there were privies, small outhouses with wooden seats, tucked in gardens, or built over streams. In castles, stone chutes called garderobes opened out to the moat or a pit below. Some were built into high towers, with wind whistling past as one did their business. They were cold, drafty, and not particularly private, but they worked. In homes, especially for the poor, chamber pots were common. These were emptied into dung pits, compost piles, or outside in the street, a practice that led to laws requiring people to call out before tossing waste from upper windows, despite the smell. There was care. Some used ashes or straw to cover waste. Sand, moss, or soft cloth served as toilet paper, and public latrines, especially in monasteries, were maintained with a sense of order, cleaned regularly and sometimes perfumed with herbs or smoke. The word hygiene didn't yet exist, but respect for the human body did. People did their best with what they had. They built systems, passed down habits, and taught children how to be clean in a world that was muddy and unpredictable. And in the quiet of a darkened chamber, with only a candle flickering beside a ceramic pot, someone long ago might have felt what we all feel in such moments, the humble reminder of being human. The smell of the Middle Ages. It's easy to imagine the past as something dirty, as if the air itself were always heavy with filth. But the truth, like most things, is quieter and more layered. Yes. Streets could smell of waste after rain. Yes. Animals walked among people. And yes. Refuse sometimes lingered longer than it should. But people noticed. People cared. And they did more than you might think to live among the smells. Herbs were their shield. In kitchens, bundles of sage and thyme hung from beams. Not just to flavor stew, but to scent the air. In bedrooms, lavender pillows were tucked beneath linen sheets. On feast days, rushes and herbs were scattered across stone floors not only to soften footsteps but to bring freshness underfoot. Those who could afford perfumes wore little pomander, small metal balls filled with cloves, cinnamon, and resin. These were worn on chains or tucked into sleeves. In churches, incense curled into the rafters, sweet and smoky, reminding the faithful of heaven. Clean shirts helped too. People believed that a fresh linen shirt could absorb bad odors and keep the body balanced. And so, even in places where soap was scarce and water precious, people reached for smells that comforted them, that masked what they could not change. So while you might picture the Middle Ages as a world of stink and grime, the truth is more like a tapestry woven with rosemary, wool, wood smoke, and wildflowers. And if you could close your eyes and breathe in deeply near a monastery garden or a noblewoman's chamber, you might find yourself surprised by sweetness, hospitals, clean hands, and holy healing. Long before antiseptic wipes or sterile gloves, care still existed. Healing was a sacred act, and cleanliness played a role even if people didn't yet understand germs. Monasteries often held the earliest hospitals. These weren't just places for the sick, but shelters for the poor, the weary, and the wounded. Monks and nuns tended to patients with a quiet discipline. Beds were simple. Sheets were changed often, washed in hot water and dried in the sun. Clean hands were emphasized not because of bacteria, but because healing was seen as holy. Dirty hands could offend the soul. So monks washed before touching the sick, sometimes even anointing hands with oil mixed with herbs. Wounds were cleaned with wine or vinegar. Compresses were made from crushed plants like comfrey or yarrow. Rooms were aired with open shutters, letting in breeze and light. And prayers rose alongside the scent of lavender water and beeswax candles. Even barbers, who handled bloodletting and tooth pulling, kept their tools in rolls of cloth. They sharpened blades carefully, wiped them between uses, and washed their aprons after long days. To be ill in medieval times was to rely on touch, scent, and ritual. Healing wasn't just about herbs, it was about being seen, bathed, and comforted. And while medicine lacked what we now know, it held its own form of care. So in the cool stillness of a stone infirmary, with white linen rustling and the hum of quiet voices, healing came slowly, gently, and always by human hands. The rules of the monks and the cleanliness of the soul. Inside the thick stone walls of monasteries, time moved differently. Bells rang out to mark each hour. Prayer followed labor. Silence was treasured, and cleanliness of body and soul was part of daily life. Monks lived by it. Rule, not just a belief, but a written guide for every part of the day. The rule of Saint Benedict, followed by many, spoke not only of prayer and humility, but of washing. Monks were to wash their hands before meals, their feet after travel, and their faces each morning in cold, clear water. Clothing was simple but cared for. Robes were brushed, folded, and changed regularly. Linen undergarments were washed weekly. Hair was trimmed in careful circles. Baths were taken modestly and without vanity on schedule. In the lavatorium, a kind of communal washing area, large stone basins filled with fresh water. Hands were scrubbed before entering the refectory. Feet were sometimes washed as a sign of service and brotherhood. And even when soap was rough and the water cold, the act of washing held meaning. It was a way to honor the body without worshipping it. A reminder that cleanliness, like prayer, could be a form of discipline. The air in a monastery was scented not with perfume, but with beeswax, parchment, and earth. The stone walls stayed cool, and the world outside noisy. Busy seemed to fade beneath the rhythm of bells and clean footsteps in bare halls. And as the monks lay down in their straw beds each night, after washing their hands and whispering the last prayers, a deep and silent peace settled over them, a peace born of order, of habit, of quiet care. The bath attendant and the steam house silence. In some towns, tucked between timbered shops and cobbled lanes, stood bathhouses, public places of warmth and water. People from all walks of life came here, not just to wash, but to sit and steam, to rest, to be human together. The bath attendant was a quiet figure, often an older woman or man with a calm voice. They filled the tubs, stoked the fires, poured water scented with rosemary or pine. They knew each creak of the floorboards, each gust of warm air that curled through the wooden slats when guests entered. They were offered slippers and robes. Their clothes were folded neatly. The air inside shimmered with moisture, and voices stayed low, as though everyone sensed they were stepping into something sacred. In the steam rooms, heat opened the pores, eased the muscles, and slowed the breath. People spoke gently, or not at all. The bath attendants sometimes brought bowls of cold water with floating net leaves or wiped brows with a cloth warmed over the coals. Though the practice was often interrupted by suspicion or plague, in peaceful years, bathhouses were beloved. They offered more than hygiene, they offered peace, a place to let the weight of the world dissolve in warm mist. And when the water cooled and guests stressed again, they often stepped back into the street feeling not just cleaner, but somehow lighter. The bath attendant would tidy up in silence, pour the last of the water down the stone drain, and wait for the next weary soul to arrive. Children, dirt, and the tender lessons of washing. Medieval children ran barefoot through the dust. They played in fields, climbed trees, and helped in gardens, often with smudges on their cheeks and twigs in their hair. Cleanliness, for them, was taught slowly and with care. Mothers or older sisters would wash small faces with linen cloths, dipped in warm water. They wiped hands before meals, combed through tangled curls, and whispered gentle reminders to rinse after using the chamber pot. Bath time was an event. Water was heated in pots over the fire and poured into wooden tubs. Siblings often bathed together, youngest first. Soap made from Ashan fat was rubbed into knees and elbows. It didn't smell sweet, but it worked. Children laughed, splashed, and sometimes squirmed away from the cloth. But there was comfort in those moments, in the hands that scrubbed gently, in the towel warmed by the hearth, in the sense of being loved through care. Even in poorer homes, where water was scarcer, a mother might dip a rag into vinegar and water to wipe a child's feet at the end of the day. In winter, snow was scooped into basins and rubbed on pink faces to wake them up for morning chores. These rituals were quiet lessons that cleanliness wasn't just about appearance, it was about self-respect, health, and dignity. And as the children curled up at night, wrapped in wool and the lingering scent of wood smoke, they carried with them those soft, human acts of washing, small beginnings of a lifelong rhythm. The market, the butcher, and the washing of hands. The medieval market was alive with smells and sound, spices from far-off lands, loaves of dark bread, the cries of merchants selling salted fish or honeyed fruit. But for those who worked there, especially the butchers and bakers, cleanliness mattered deeply. Butchers, in particular, kept buckets of water beside their stalls. Their aprons were often stained, yes, but their knives were rinsed regularly, their hands wiped after each customer. Meat was cut quickly and hung in the open air, and between transactions, hands were scrubbed with salt and water to keep flies away. Bakers used clean cloths to cover rising dough, and swept flour from their benches with straw brushes. Even the sellers of herbs and vegetables splashed water over their goods in the early morning to make them sparkle with dew. There were no inspections, no regulations like today, but there was pride. A market stall was your name, your trade, your living, and those who kept their place tidy often earned the most trust. Nearby, at the edges of the market square, fountains or wells offered water for washing. People rinsed their hands, doused their faces in summer, or let cool water run between their fingers before breaking bread. And though the market might end in muddy footprints and scattered crumbs, there was something honest in it all. In the wet hands of a merchant, and the steaming cloth of a baker, in the sharp steel of a clean knife, there lived the everyday care of ordinary people. Each gesture, each wash, was a quiet reminder that even in the busiest of places, there is room for grace. The laundry day and the river's rhythm. Laundry was not a quiet task, but it had a rhythm, a kind of music all its own. The splash of water against cloth, the creak of wooden paddles, the swish of linen unfurling in the breeze. On certain days, especially in spring and summer, the banks of rivers and streams filled with women bent in half-light, sleeves rolled, laughter rising with the steam. To wash clothes was to work, and to watch, water had to be carried in buckets or drawn from deep wells. As soap, made at home from lion fat, was stirred into basins with cold or boiled water. White linen was soaked and scrubbed, pounded with smooth stones or wooden clubs. In some towns, communal washhouses existed, covered shelters with stone troughs and benches. Women shared stories while wringing out tunics and aprons. The soap might sting their fingers, but the conversation softened the day. Clothing was rinsed several times. Hung on hedgerows or laid across fields to dry in the sun. It smelled of earth and grass, of wood smoke and water. A freshly laundered shirt was a source of pride, no matter how humble the garment. Even in winter, snow could be melted for washing, or clothes were simply beaten to remove dust and aired for freshness. No one expected perfection, but they expected care. And when the sun sank low and the last shirt was folded into a basket, there was peace in it, the quiet knowledge that something had been cleansed, made new again, touched by water and wind and human hands. Linen layers, and the hygiene of dress. In the Middle Ages, clothing did more than warm the body. It protected the skin, absorbed sweat, and helped keep the outer layers clean. And so, hygiene lived not just in washing but in how people dressed. The layer closest to the body was nearly always linen. Soft, breathable, and light in color, linen undergarments were prized for their ability to stay dry and fresh. These shirts and shifts were washed often even if the woolen garments above them were not. Men wore long tunics or short-sleeved chemises under surcoats and cloaks. Women wore shifts beneath gowns, sometimes changing them every few days. Wealthier households had more sets, with some people changing linen daily. For peasants, one or two might last the week, but even they tried to keep it clean. Wool, while harder to wash, was brushed, aired, and beaten free of dust. Cloaks were hung by open windows, boots were scraped clean of mud, caps and hoods were wiped down with damp cloths. Linen collars, cuffs, and coats could be removed and washed separately, keeping the appearance neat. Lace and embroidery were reserved for special garments, and often gently hand-washed in warm water with soapwort. Even armor had its rituals. Padded gambesons worn beneath were washed and aired, while the metal plates were polished with vinegar and oil to resist rust. Nights depended on cleanliness just as much as comfort. To dress each morning was an act of quiet intention, a moment to layer protection, identity, and dignity over the body. And when someone walked past with a clean collar, a fresh tunic, or a well-kept hem, others noticed not with envy, but with respect. Cleanliness, after all, wasn't about vanity. It was about showing care for yourself and for those around you. Nighttime routines, and the washing before sleep. When the stars began to rise over the hills and the hearth crackled low, the world slowed. In cottages and keeps alike, people prepared for rest not just by closing shutters or banking the fire, but by turning to the quiet rituals of evening hygiene. A basin of water sat near the door or the bed. Cold, clear, often still with leaves floating inside, it waited for the final wash. People dipped their hands, cupped water to rinse their faces, wiped their necks with linen cloths. The chill was bracing, but it signaled the end of labor, the beginning of peace. Feet were cleaned, especially in summer. Dust and mud from the road were scrubbed off with cloth or straw. Children were helped by their mothers, who gently rubbed their heels and dried between their toes with practiced hands. In noble homes, warm water might be brought in a copper jug. Servants would fill ceramic basins, scent the water with lavender or chamomile, and leave soft towels by the bed. But even in the humblest homes, a splash of water before sleep was a treasured comfort. Hair was combed out by firelight. Braids were loosened, caps tied in place. Fingernails were checked, shirts removed, and wool blankets shaken to free them from hay or crumbs. The body, no matter how tired, was gently made ready for rest. And then came the stillness, The moment after the last candle was snuffed, when skin was cool from washing, sheets rustled, and the air smelled faintly of soap, ash, and earth, it was then that sleep came not just as escape, but as reward. A gift earned through honest work, quiet care, and the small, tender rituals that reminded even the poorest soul, you are worth the comfort of being clean. The market smells, and the subtle art of staying fresh. The market was not quiet. It buzzed and clattered, full of voices and hooves and haggling. But beneath the loudness lived a different story, a story of small efforts to stay fresh in a world that rarely paused. Women passed with baskets of herbs slung over their arms, parsley, thyme, fennel. Not only for soup, but for scent. A tucked sprig of mint behind the ear, a handful of dried lavender in a cloth pouch beneath the bodice. These were the perfumes of ordinary people. Vendors stood all day, sun on their backs. The fishmonger wiped his hands constantly with briny rags, his apron soaked with salt water. The baker brushed flour from his sleeves and kept a damp cloth to wipe the sweat from his brow. Some chewed cloves or aniseed to freshen their breath. Others boiled rosemary or marjoram and dabbed the water behind their ears. A bit of vinegar on a cloth might be wiped across the neck or hands. In summer, water infused with lemon peel was prized in cities where the heat lingered in stone alleys. Clothing helped to layers of linen close to the skin absorbed what needed to be hidden. These undergarments were changed when possible, rinsed in a stream or scrubbed at the edge of town. And then there were the subtle touches, a comb run through hair before walking into town. A clean ribbon tied at the wrist, hands washed in rainwater caught in a basin. Freshness, in those days, was not about absence of odor, it was about intention. About not offending others, about dignity, and about presenting oneself as someone who still noticed the body even when life was difficult. So the market, for all its noise and clamor, was also a place of care, of effort, of quiet ways people tried, every day, to remain softer on the edges in a world of smoke and sweat. Childhood cleanliness and the songs that came with it. In the quiet corners of villages and manors alike, cleanliness began early with children swaddled not only in cloth, but in love and ritual. A mother's hands guided, a father's voice calmed. And washing became something more than habit, it became song. Infants were bathed in shallow wooden tubs, the water warmed by the hearth. A soft linen cloth wiped over their skin, and herbal oils pressed from calendula or chamomile were gently rubbed into the scalp. Their tiny hands were cleaned with kisses between each finger. Older children knew the rhythms of daily care. Hands washed after chores, feet rinsed before bed. Hair combed in long strokes while the fire popped. Girls helped their mothers, boys copied their fathers, and when they protested, songs filled the air. Wash the toes and count the stars, scrub the elbows, skip the scars. Dip and rinse and hum a tune, be fresh and clean by silver moon. Children played in mud, climbed trees, and ran through markets. But by twilight, their bodies were returned to order. They sat quietly while warm cloths wiped away the day. The scent of soaproot and sun lingered on their skin. When illness came, and it often did, cleanliness became sacred. Sheets were boiled, hands were scrubbed, cups were kept separate. Mothers whispered prayers while they cleaned little foreheads with vinegar water and sang lullabies low and slow. Even the poorest families, with little more than rainwater and rags, kept these rituals alive. Because cleanliness, in childhood, was never just about hygiene. It was about love. About holding small bodies with reverence, about passing down not only habits, but tenderness. And so the songs endured. The cloths were rinsed. And childhood, in all its dirt and wildness, was gently returned to stillness before every sleep. The church, the soul, and the sacredness of clean hands. To step into a church in medieval times was to step into stillness. Cold stone beneath your feet, filtered light through colored glass, the faint scent of incense and beeswax rising in the air. And before anything else, before prayer, before the sign of the cross, there was the washing of hands. Near the door, a small basin, often carved from stone, held holy water, fingers dipped, foreheads touched, a quiet gesture of cleansing, not of dirt, but of spirit. The body prepared the soul. Monks and nuns, whose lives were marked by routine and reverence, washed their hands before every meal, every service, every act of labor. A pitcher would pour clear water over waiting hands while psalms were whispered. The towel, simple and worn, was folded with care. Pilgrims, dusty from weeks on the road, would kneel outside before entering a shrine. They would rinse their feet in a shared bowl, scrape mud from their cloaks, and comb their hair with borrowed fingers. To present oneself clean before God was not vanity, it was humility. Even the act of confession began with small ablutions. A priest might wash his hands in silence. Before listening, his fingers would smell faintly of frankincense and soap. On feast days, entire communities washed more thoroughly. Garments were brushed, faces were scrubbed, children's hair was tied with ribbons, bells rang, and people arrived not perfect, but prepared. In the church, candles flickered like stars in stone sky. The echo of chant floated through arches, and among the incense, the prayers, and the ancient wooden pews, there lingered always the quiet truth. To cleanse the hands was to ready the heart. To wash before God was to say, I have tried to be whole. And that even in the Middle Ages was a kind of beauty beyond words. The healing garden, and the hands that gathered, behind the walls of monasteries and within the courtyards of manor houses, there grew gardens not just of beauty, but of medicine. These were healing gardens, green, humming places where hygiene began with the leaf, the root, the flower. There, bent over rows of sage and calendula, were the gatherers. Often they were monks, or nuns, or older women from the village who had learned the ways of the earth by watching their mothers and grandmothers. They knew when to pick each plant not by date, but by the softness of the stem, the scent in the air, the feel of the season in their hands. Chamomile for calming, mint for freshening the breath, rosemary for rubbing into sore muscles and steeping in foot baths, comfrey for wounds, marigold for the skin. Every herb had a purpose, and those who gathered them washed their hands first. Always, as though the act of healing began not in the garden, but in the gesture, in the shade. They dried leaves on woven mats. Flowers were strung upside down to keep their color. Roots were scrubbed and chopped, then boiled down in thick pots to make salves and ointments. These potions were used to clean wounds, scent linens, wash hair, or steep into teas for fever and restlessness. Some were simple, others were complex recipes, passed down in silence, guarded like treasure. And the garden itself was clean, not manicured, not perfect but purposeful. Pots were swept, water was fetched, beds were weeded. It was a living pharmacy built on time, care, and the understanding that healing begins long before a fever takes hold. So when someone stepped into that garden, even in the darkest times, they stepped into hope, into the scent of thyme and beeswax, into the work of hands that gathered and never stopped believing in gentle restoration. The barbers, the razors, and the ritual of the blade. Barbers in the Middle Ages were more than hair cutters. They were surgeons, tooth pullers, bleeders of bad humors, but beyond their strange and varied tasks, they were also keepers of an ancient ritual, the razor and the wash. Their shops were small and often filled with light from a single window. There was always a chair, a basin, and the sharp gleam of steel. Hanging on the walls were strops, towels, bottles of oil, and sometimes herbs dried bay or lavender to calm the air. Before each shave, a cloth was dipped in hot water and pressed to the client's face. The steam opened pores, softened the beard, and made conversation unnecessary. The barber would wipe the skin gently, speak only if spoken to, and run his thumb along the blade with reverence. The razor was stropped again and again, until it gleamed like a crescent moon. Soap was whipped into a lather, thick and fragrant, and painted on with a soft bristle brush. Then came the shave, slow, deliberate, like a dance. The sound was almost nothing, a whisper of steel on skin, the faint crackle of hair. The barber cleaned the blade between strokes, wiped away the lather, then splashed the skin with cool water infused with rose or vinegar. It was intimate, but never rushed. To be shaved in this way was to be treated as someone worthy of precision, care, and stillness. And for many men, it was the only time they were touched with such quiet purpose. The barber's towel was always clean, his blade was always honed, his shop smelled of smoke, oil, and soap. And when a man stepped out, cheeks smooth, had light, something in him had shifted. He was not just groomed, He was renewed. The privy, the nightjar, and the truth of quiet needs. Not every part of hygiene was graceful. Some things were practical, necessary, quiet, and yet, even here behind wooden doors, in shadows, or at night there was dignity. The privy was often a small, detached building, sometimes stone, sometimes timber, with a simple seat above a pit. In castles, it might be a chute built into the outer wall. In townhouses, a bench behind the courtyard. In villages, a spot near the edge of the field, marked by familiarity. Lime was scattered into the pit to control smell. Ashes, too. Doors were kept closed. A small jug of water or cloth might be left nearby. And though it was not spoken of in polite company, everyone knew this too was part of life. At night, especially in winter, few wanted to walk outside. So the nightjar came out, a ceramic or wooden pot, kept under the bed. It was used quietly, respectfully, and emptied each morning by someone in the household. For noble women, servants carried scented sachets and perfumed cloths. In monasteries, communal privies were kept scrubbed and built with channels of running water when possible. It was not perfect, but it was effort. People washed after, not always with soap, but with water or cloth. And there were rules instated, but followed. Wash your hands. Don't speak of smells. Mind your turn. Keep the cloths dry. Even in discomfort, people sought order. A kind of invisible cleanliness, not just of body, but of routine. And so, as the stars turned overhead and houses quieted, the last rituals of the day were done in the dim glow of embers. And even this most human of acts was touched by care, because in the Middle Ages, as now, cleanliness wasn't always about what could be seen. It was often about what was done quietly, faithfully, and without applause. The village bathhouse and the steam that spoke of rest. In many villages, there was one place where warmth waited on cold days and stillness wrapped itself around weary limbs, the bathhouse. Though simple in form, often little more than wood and stone, it stood like a secret sanctuary for bodies aching from toil and chill. The bathhouse was often heated by a great fire beneath or beside a large tub. Water was carried in buckets, heated slowly, mixed with cooler jugs, until the temperature was just right. The steam rose in ribbons, curling into corners, softening the walls and the silence. Men and women usually bathed separately, on different days or in separate spaces. In towns, there might be several rooms, warm chambers lined with benches, steam rooms filled with herbs like thyme or eucalyptus, and cold pools for those who wished to finish their visit with a shiver and clarity. Villagers scrubbed with rough cloths or bundles of dried twigs. Ash soap, often homemade, was rubbed into the skin with slow, circular motions. Water was poured from above, not in haste, but as if returning the body to its place of rest. People washed each other too. Wives scrubbed husbands' backs. Friends helped untangle hair. Even strangers offered soap with a nod. The bathhouse was not just a place for cleaning, it was a place for gentleness. For sitting in warmth when the world was cold. For pausing without needing to speak. After the bath, bodies were wrapped in linen or wool. Tea was sometimes offered, hot water steeped with mint or chamomile. There were stories, laughter, yawns. And then, one by one, people drifted back into the dark streets, cleaner, lighter, softer than when they came. The bathhouse did not promise perfection, but it gave something far rarer, a moment when warmth touched the skin and silence settled in the bones. The traveler's wash and the rites of the road. Not all had homes. Some had paths long, winding, and certain roads stretching through forest and field, from market to monastery, from one village to the next. Travelers in the Middle Ages were merchants, messengers, pilgrims, seekers. And even on the road, they sought cleanliness, though it was humble and improvised. At rivers and streams, they would stop enrolling a linen cloth, laying down their satchel. They would strip to the waist and wash with cupped hands, teeth chattering in the spring melt or sighing in the summer heat. Water was sacred, no matter how small the pool. And the act of bathing in the wild was done with quiet gratitude. Boots were removed, soles dried, tunics beaten clean of dust. A wooden comb would pull through knots while birds chirped nearby. Some travelers carried a bundle of herbs, lavender to rub into tired feet, bay leaf for joints, or rosemary for the scalp. A vial of vinegar water might be used to wipe the forehead. A scrap of soap was guarded carefully, wrapped in cloth like a treasure. Add-ins, if coin allowed, a small bath could be requested. A tub filled while the guest waited, sitting by the hearth. Towels warmed by the fire. A drink offered, mead or cider, as the body slowly returned to stillness. Yet many nights were spent outdoors under trees or beneath eaves. And even then, care was taken, a rinse from a water skin, or rubbed down with a dry cloth, a clean shift pulled over a weary chest. The road did not forgive easily. But those who walked it knew, to wash was to remember that one was more than a traveler. One was still whole, still worthy of care. And so, among stones and stars, cleanliness walked quietly beside the dusty feet of the wandering. The midwife's hands and the ritual of birth. When a child was ready to arrive, the village turned toward its midwife, the one who had seen birth take root in silence, who had guided life from darkness into morning. Her hands were known, trusted, and always clean. She came with a cloth bundle, tied with cord, towels, boiled linen, herbs, ointments, and a small pot of soap. Before touching the mother, she washed her hands with water warmed by the hearth, even if the hour was late or the room cold. The washing was never skipped. It was sacred. The space was made ready not with candles and prayers alone, but with order. Straw was laid. Sheets were hung for warmth. Water was kept simmering. All was quiet but the breath of the woman laboring, and the soft murmur of the midwife's voice. During birth, cloths were changed again and again. Warm water was poured gently to ease pain, to clean, to bless. Herbs were crushed and wrapped in cloth for the mother to smell sweet balm, rose, a little mint. The child was caught in linen, eyes blinking at dim light. The umbilical cord was cut with a clean blade and tied with washed thread. The midwife wiped the newborn carefully, not to remove all, but to welcome gently. Then came the bath, a shallow basin, warm water scented faintly with flowers. The midwife washed the baby's head with steady fingers, rinsed tiny limbs, and wrapped the infant in fresh cloth. The mother, too, was tended. Her face wiped. Her hair smoothed. Her hands held until sleep arrived. For in that moment, hygiene was not only for health. It was for love. For reverence. For honoring the miracle of arrival. And so, long before medicine had names for what the midwife knew, she kept the oldest truth, that to welcome life cleanly was to welcome it kindly. And that every hand must first be washed with care before holding the weight of a soul. The laundress by the river and the rhythm of soap and stone. At the edge of nearly every village, where willows bent toward the water and birds dipped their beaks to drink, worked the laundresses. They were women with strong arms, rolled sleeves, and voices that carried over the stream like birdsong. Before sunrise, they came with baskets of linen, wooden paddles, bars of ash soap wrapped in cloth. The river was not merely a place for cleaning, it was a place of rhythm, of routine, of soft, shared silence. Clothes were soaked and scrubbed against worn stones, or pounded gently with the wooden beetle. Soap made from tallow and lye was rubbed in slow circles into the fabric. Stains were treated with vinegar, or sometimes just elbow and patience. The river did not hurry, and neither did the women. As they worked, they told stories of births, of bad harvests, of dreams. Laughter wove through the steam that rose when hot water was poured from kettles. When the weather turned cold, their breath joined the mist in great cloudy puffs. Between rinses, cloths were laid on bushes to dry or hung over wooden poles. Whites caught the sun. Colors fluttered like faded flags. And still the water ran, and still the paddles struck, and still the river listened. Children helped too, fetching water or wringing out smaller garments. Girls watched their mothers, learned the rhythm, learned the patience. It was not a glamorous task, but it was important. Clean clothes brought dignity. They meant readiness for market, for mass, for marriage. They meant comfort during sleep and pride in appearance. And the laundress, though often unnoticed, was the keeper of that dignity. So when the baskets were finally lifted and the last cloth wrung dry, the women walked home slowly, their arms tired but their hearts steady. The day was done. The river had spoken. And the world was just a little cleaner. The noble's chamber and the perfume of power. Far from the village stream and the stone towers of lords and ladies, another form of cleanliness held sway, a quieter, more perfumed, more adorned with silks than soap. Yet even among velvet and wealth, hygiene still whispered its ancient songs. Noble chambers were dark and cool, lit by candles and warmed by tapestries. Servants moved through the rooms with purpose, carrying basins of warm rosewater, bringing cloths scented with thyme, placing fresh sprigs of rosemary in the corners to mask the smell of closed air. Baths, for those of means, were elaborate events. A wooden tub lined with cloth, filled by servants with buckets warmed by fire. Petals might float upon the water of lavender, marigold, even crushed strawberries in the summer months. The noblewoman sat in the water as her hair was brushed with ivory combs. The nobleman leaned back while his neck was wiped with soft linen. Not every day, no, baths were rare, precious, nearly ceremonial. But when they came, they were wrapped in silence and candlelight. Between such occasions, the body was maintained in other ways. Daily, faces and hands were washed. Perfumed oils were dabbed at the wrists, temples, and behind the ears. Linen underclothes were changed more often than outer garments, and feet were massaged with mint or sweet balm. To smell pleasant, in court or castle, was to show control. It was to mask the wildness of the world outside, the mud, the animals, the fires. Barbers, too, tended daily. They not only shaved and trimmed but cleaned ears, pulled teeth, lanced boils, all in the name of refinement. Their tools were precise, their hands skilled, their cloths clean. Hygiene, in the noble class, was not only about health. It was about image. It was about being above the earth even while living upon it. And when a noble stepped from their chamber freshly powdered and scented with orange blossom or clove, the world saw not just status, but someone who had learned the art of quiet elegance in a time of rough living. The monastery washroom and the water of the spirit. Within high stone walls, beneath the bells and chanting, monks moved through a world ruled by silence and sacred routine. Each action had its hour. Each hour, its task. And among these tasks, hygiene held its place, quiet, humble, but deeply respected. The monastery had a lavatorium, a long washroom where basins stood beneath stone spouts. Water flowed gently from small carved mouths of lions, sheep, or angels, depending on the order. It was cold, clear, and ever-moving, like the life of the monks themselves. Before meals, before prayers, before copying manuscripts, monks would pause. They lined up calmly, washed their hands without haste, dried them with cloths kept folded in wooden chests. No talking. Just the sound of water, footsteps on stone, the creak of robes. In the early mornings, faces were washed with water drawn from the well. Beards trimmed with bone-handled shears. Nails cleaned with little knives. Feet tended when sore from garden work or pilgrimage walks. Clothes were plain but kept orderly. Sandals were wiped free of dust. Linen habits were washed in the monastery yard, hung behind stone walls where sun and wind did their part. Infirmaries, tended by monk physicians, were kept scrupulously clean. Beds were aired, wounds bathed, hands always washed before touching the sick. Salves were made from herbs grown in the cloister garden, sage, wormwood, comfrey, and applied with reverent care. The monks believed that to cleanse the body was to make space for the soul, to remove the distractions of discomfort, to honor the vessel given by God. And so, within walls that held no vanity, hygiene was not a chore. It was prayer made physical. And water cold, honest, and pure was the first blessing of every day. The pilgrimage path and the washing of the soul. A pilgrimage was more than a journey. It was a surrender of comfort, of certainty, of the everyday. Pilgrims walked miles, sometimes for weeks or months, following sacred routes toward holy sites. Santiago.Canterbury.Rome. And with each step, the body gathered dust while the spirit sought cleansing. Yet even on the open road, hygiene found its place. At way stations, hostels, and monasteries along the path, weary travelers would rest and wash. Not always fully, and not always in comfort. But feet, blistered from miles of stone and mud, were soaked in warm water. Dust was scrubbed from faces and hands. Dirty tunics were rinsed in basins beside the fire, laid to dry over branches or simple ropes. Some shrines had sacred springs or wells, said to hold healing powers. Pilgrims would approach quietly, cupping water in their palms to cleanse their faces, anoint their heads, or sip in silence. The water was believed to purify more than skin, it softened the burdens of the soul. Pilgrims often carried small bundles, a sliver of soap, a comb, or rag of linen. Not much, but enough to offer care to their bodies as they walked towards something greater than themselves. At night, the act of cleaning became part of their evening ritual. Wiping the sweat from their brow, rinsing sore feet, whispering a prayer while dabbing vinegar on a wound. They might sleep in haylofts or beneath the stars. But even in those rough places, the ritual remained. To wash on the road was not just for health, it was a declaration: I still belong to the world. I still carry the dignity of being human. And so, even in silence, even in solitude, the pilgrim walked with a kind of grace, one foot before the other, one washcloth against the skin, carrying not only dust, but hope. The candlemaker's wife and the scent of clean tallow. In the heart of a busy medieval town, tucked between the apothecary and the butcher's stall, lived a woman known only as the candlemaker's wife. Her fingers were forever marked by wax and work, and her home smelled of beeswax, ash, and something sweet, perhaps lavender, stored in drawers. Their cottage was small, the windows streaked, the floors often dusty from soot and wood chips. But within those walls, the woman kept a tidy, glowing world, where cleanliness meant more than mere polish. Each morning, she wiped the wooden counters with vinegar water, brewed from the dregs of sour cider. She swept the hearth with care, then beat the rugs in the back alley. Ashes were saved in a pail, not thrown away, but used to make soap. Yes, soap. She boiled rainwater with lye she leached from the ashes, stirring until the mixture turned thick and pale. Into this, she added tallow of the clean fat from animals, rendered carefully and filtered through cloth. The result was rough, beige soap that smelled faintly of earth, but cleaned well and lasted long. She used it to scrub pots, to wash hands, to launder the shirts of her husband after long hours over fire. On washing days, she filled the copper tub and gently scrubbed her arms, her neck, her legs, humming a tune as steam rose around her. A little rose water behind the ears. A comb pulled slowly through her hair. Clean didn't mean luxurious. It meant made with care. It meant taking what little the world gave and making it enough. The candlemaker's wife wrapped soap in cloth and sold it alongside her husband as tapers. People came not just for light, but for the small bar of something pure. And in the quiet of her tidy home, where wax cooled on wooden boards and clean linens fluttered near the fire, she lived a life of soft simplicity, where each small act of washing was not a burden, but a light. The winter bath and the hearthside stillness. When snow lay heavy on the thatched roofs and the wind sang through every crack in the timber, the thought of bathing in cold water made even the bravest shudder. And yet, winter did not stop the need for cleanliness, only changed how it was done. In the cold months, water was precious and slow. Buckets had to be broken of ice, carried with stiff fingers, warmed with patience. The bath, a wooden tub, often round and deep, was brought near the hearth, where firelight danced along the walls. Baths in winter were rare, sometimes only once or twice a season. But when they happened, they became something close to sacred. Clothes were peeled off in the fire's glow. Warm cloths wrapped around shoulders. Steam from the boiling pot misted the windows. And the first splash of hot water brought sighs of relief and gratitude. Children were bathed first, a quick, laughing, splashing under the careful eye of their mother. Then the parents, one after the other, soaking sore joints, eyes closing with every ladle poured. Herbs were added to the water, pine needles, dried mint, a pinch of salt. The scent filled the room, mixing with wood smoke and bread rising in the nearby oven. Afterward, towels, coarse but clean, were pressed into skin. Feet rubbed dry and placed in warm socks. A drop of oil on the scalp. A clean tunic pulled over tired arms. And then, rest. Bodies curled on benches near the fire. A cup of broth passed from hand to hand. Steam fading into quiet. In those frozen months, to wash was not only about the body. It was about warmth. About coming in from the dark. About reminding oneself that even in coldest times, the home was a haven, and the water, though hard won, was healing. And as night fell outside, and snow crept across the windows, there in the flicker of the fire, a clean body rested, a warm heart slowed, and sleep came. As gentle as falling snow. The shepherd's river and the washing beneath the sky. High in the green hills, where fences were nothing but stone piles, and the wind carried the scent of heather and sheep, lived the shepherds. They were men of few words and deep weather lines across their faces. Days began with the sky and ended with stars. In between, there were hooves, wool, barking dogs, and silence. But even there, among moss and solitude, hygiene had its quiet place. The shepherd knew the rhythm of water. Every stream, every hollow in the rock that held clear rain, every cold trickle that ran down the hill, these were his wash basins, his mirrors, his lifelines. At dawn, he would kneel by the river's edge. Hands, cracked from rope and cold, cupped water and brought it to his face. No soap. Just water of the mountain kind, pure and clean as breath. He would rinse the sleep away, blink toward the sun, and begin. There were no towels, only the breeze and the warmth of movement. Shirts, when they grew stiff from sweat or mud, were rinsed in the current and hung from branches. A rough shirt cleaned by river and wind smelled not of perfume but of life. The shepherd's hair was combed with his fingers. His teeth rubbed with a cloth soaked in salt or mint leaves. His hands washed again and again after birthings, after blood, after rain. Hygiene in the highlands was not a routine, but an instinct. To wash was to return to the rhythm of the world, water to skin, wind to cheek, earth to foot. And there, under a sky untouched by chimney smoke, the shepherd walked clean in a world that never noticed, and never needed to. He needed no mirror to know when he felt well. Only the river, and its song. The sick room, and the gentle hands of care. In the shadowy corner of the village house, behind the thick curtain and near the fire, was the sick. It was simple, the cot, a bundle of wool, a small table. But for the one who lay there, it was the whole world. And in that world, hygiene was tenderness. The caregiver, a mother, sister, husband who moved with careful steps. Their hands always warm. Their touch slow. First, the cloths were boiled. Not always easy when firewood was low, but always worth it. Linens were changed, wrung dry, laid fresh. The old ones were scrubbed in ash water and dried in the wind. The sick were sponged with damp cloths, forehead, chest, arms. Eyes cleaned with chamomile. Hair brushed gently with oil. Bed sores soothed with honey or lamb's grease. There was no rush. No machines. Just the rhythm of breathing, the patience of care, and the sound of water in a bowl. Herbs were burned to cleanse the air. Lavender, rue, wormwood. The room would smell sharp, earthy, then calm. The sick, whether fevered or fading, were kept as clean as the world allowed. Hands were washed often after every dressing, every touch. Warm water and soap if there was any. Vinegar if not. Sometimes, care meant more than healing. It meant dignity. A clean shirt for someone who couldn't lift their arms. A comb run gently through hair that had tangled in sleep. A kiss to a clean cheek before nightfall. And when the illness passed, the first full bath felt like a celebration. When it did not, the body was still washed, still wrapped with care, still laid to rest with hands folded and face at peace. Because in this place and time, to cleanse another was an act of love, a deep, sacred, and lasting. And in the quiet of the sick room, beneath the woven quilt and the hush of whispered prayers, the gentlest form of hygiene was always compassion. The market day and the washing of hands before coins. Once a week, the village stirred from its quiet rhythm and bloomed into sound. Market day. Stalls sprang up like mushrooms. Baskets overflowed with greens and wool and fish. Bells rang. Children weaved through legs. Hens clucked in crates. And amid all the noise, hands touched everything. To sell was to shake hands, to count coins, to slice cheese, to feel the grain of a tunic or the ripeness of a pear. And so, and seen by most, a ritual began at dawn, one of water and readiness. Merchants washed their hands first. Not with ceremony, but with steadiness. A basin outside the stall. A cloth warmed by the fire. A scrap of soap, or just vinegar and rosemary. Hands were scrubbed, dried, rubbed with mint leaves. Not everyone noticed, but customers remembered. The fishmonger cleaned beneath his nails with a small twig. The baker brushed flour from his arms, then wiped with linen soaked in boiled lemon peel. The herb seller passed bowls of fragrant rinse to her daughters, rose and mint, thyme and salt. Clean hands were good for business. They were also good for pride. When coins passed from hand to hand, when bread was broken and fruit was offered, the feel of clean skin meant something. It meant the stall had not only goods, but care. Children were taught, before you help me sell, wash your fingers. Not for dirt, for respect. And at the end of the day, when the stalls were folded and the coins counted, hands were washed again. Dust and sweat gone. The day's work, rinsed from skin. There was no running water. No fancy soaps. But there was attention. Because in a world where the hands did everything, hands that healed, held, cooked, sewed, lifted, comforted, the simple act of washing was not small. It was everything. And as night returned, and the market was only a memory carried in tired feet and quiet satisfaction, the hands cleaned and rested were ready for tomorrow. The washerwomen by the river and the songs of soap. Down by the wide, winding river, where the stones were smooth and the willows dipped their branches into water, the washerwomen worked. It was not a quiet labor, but it was a rhythmic one full of slap, scrub, rinse, and laughter. They came in the early light, baskets balanced on hips, sleeves rolled to elbows. Their linen skirts darkened at the hem from dew and splash. And always, they sang. Their voices, carried over the rippling current, were half lullaby, half work chant. Songs of old lovers, lost children, foolish lords, and brave girls who outwitted foxes. The melodies helped pass the hours. They washed the linens of the whole village. Sheets, robes, tunics, baby wraps, burial cloths. They dipped each item into the cold river, wrung it out over knees, and beat it rhythmically against flat stones. Their soap was handmade vaslai, animal fat boiled with dried flowers or herbs. Sometimes it was gritty, sometimes too soft, but always it was enough. Between loads, they rubbed their own hands chapped from cold with beeswax and oil. And when the sun climbed high and their work was nearly done, the older women would rinse their own headscarves, their sleeves, even their feet. Not a full bath, but a refreshing small gift to themselves after giving so much to others. They spread the clean linens over the bushes and rocks to dry. The wind caught them like sails, and the field looked like a ghostly procession, white and fluttering in the sun. When they packed up, they left behind no trace but the scent of soap and a few wet footprints. And the river, faithful and eternal, rolled on, carrying away the dust of the week, carrying songs in the air. And beneath the rustling leaves, peace. The quiet monk and the sacred bath. In the heart of the stone monastery, beyond the kitchen garden and past the cloister's stillness, there was a small room. Few saw it. Fewer still spoke of it. It was the monk's bath chamber. The monks lived simply, and their vows were many: poverty, silence, humility. But within those bounds, they understood the holiness of cleanliness, not for beauty, not for pride, but for purity of purpose. Brother Enoch, a monk whose hands were often stained with ink, followed a gentle ritual. Once a week, when his duties were light, he would gather warm water in a wooden pail and enter the stone-walled room. He removed his habit slowly, folding each piece with reverence. Then, kneeling beside the tub, he dipped a linen cloth into the warm water. He began with his hands, washing the fingers that copied sacred texts. Then his face, marked with lines of study and prayer. No perfumes, no oils. Only water and a bit of rosemary soap, crushed and wrapped in cloth. He washed in silence. Not a word was spoken, not a splash made without thought. For Brother Enoch, this was not washing. This was a form of prayer. When he finished, he sat near the window, wrapped in a woolen robe. Steam rose gently from the water behind him. He listened to the birds outside, the rustling trees, the distant bell that called the brothers to evening service. And he felt not clean in body alone, but clear in spirit. For in this room, far from the world's rush and noise, the act of washing was sacred. A reminder that even dust is part of the cycle of devotion. And when Brother Enoch returned to his desk and dipped his pen once more into ink, his hands were steady, his soul quiet, his body at peace. The widow's comb and the memory of warm water. In the last house on the edge of the village, where the fields met the woods and the wind moved more freely, lived the widow. Her hair was white like milk, and her back curved softly from time and toil. She lived alone, but not in loneliness. Her days were quiet, filled with knitting, tending to herbs, and humming to the past. Once a week, she brought out the copper kettle and filled the old basin near the hearth. She did not bathe as she once did. Age had made bending difficult. But still, she kept her rituals. She warmed water slowly, stirring it with a wooden spoon. She added dried rose petals, because her late husband had loved their scent. A drop of lavender oil for dreams. Then she sat on her stool and began. A cloth dipped, wrung, pressed to her arms. Then her face. Then her feet. Each stroke slow, circular, gentle. Her skin, thin and soft, welcomed the warmth. Afterward, she combed her hair to 100 strokes each night, as her mother once taught her. The comb was old, carved by her father when she was a girl. She remembered being a child at the wash basin, her mother scrubbing her knees, laughing when she splashed. She remembered washing her own children, their giggles, their curls. Now she was alone. But the water still held those memories. To wash, for her, was not to prepare for others, it was to greet herself. To remember. To remain. When she finished, she lit a single candle, slipped into her linen nightgown, sat by the fire with her tea, and smiled. For even as age slowed her limbs and dimmed her sight, the quiet ritual of cleansing held her gently. She did not fear the night, because she had washed the day away, and with it, all sorrow. Only peace remained, and sleep, soon after. The midwife's basin and the water of first breath. In the quiet corner of every village, where women knew the signs of the moon and the hush of pain before joy, lived the midwife. She carried no grand title, no banner or robe. Only her apron, her bag, and her wisdom. When the time came when the cries began, and the lamp was lit as she moved through the dark like a shadow of comfort. And always, she brought water. The birthing room was warmed by fire and breath. Cloths soaked in boiled water were laid gently on a mother's brow, on her hands, on her swollen feet. A basin, wide and deep, held the cleansing water not just for the newborn, but for all that was sacred in the act of arrival. After the child's first breath, the midwife would clean the little body with soft linen behind the ears, under the arms, each tiny toe. No perfume, only warm water, lavender, and murmured blessings. She washed the mother to dot gently, with reverence. The sweat of labor, the tears, the blood, all gently wiped away in silence, as if preparing her not just for rest, but for rebirth of her own. The basin was emptied with care and never used without being cleaned. For life had touched that water, and life was sacred. The midwife, even after the child had quieted and the mother slept, washed her own hands again and again. In ash soap and rosemary water, in silence. Her care did not end with the baby's first breath. It ended only when all were wrapped in warmth and sleep. And as she stepped out into the night, a cold wind might brush her cheek, but her hands still held the warmth of water and the memory of a life begun clean. The night's camp and armor of dust and sweat. Far from stone halls and feasts, on muddy fields and cold plains, the knights made camp. Their tents were rough, their firewood damp, their armor thick with dust and blood. But even there, amid clanging swords and sharpened steel, the moment of stillness would come. And with it, the longing to feel clean again. After battle, after patrol, the knight would remove his armor piece by piece. First the helm, then the breastplate, then the gauntlets, each falling with a clatter that echoed into dusk. Beneath the iron was sweat, stale wool, bruised skin. The squire would bring water, not always warm, but enough. A cloth was soaked and pressed to the face, the neck, the wrists. It was not a bath, but a balm. The knight would close his eyes, not from exhaustion alone, but from relief. To be clean, even briefly, was to return to the man beneath the metal. Wounds were washed with wine or vinegar. Hands were rinsed before food. Hair was combed free of mud. If they were lucky, the fire would heat the water. If not, cold water would do. Because honor demanded more than courage. It demanded care for weapon, for armor, and for the body that bore both. In moments before sleep, the knight would breathe in the steam from his basin. Think of home. Of meadows. Of mornings where his mother wiped his face with a cloth scented by thyme. And though tomorrow might bring blood again, tonight there was only water. And the stillness that follows cleansing. The orphan's bath and the kindness of warm hands. In the crowded stone orphanage beyond the abbey gates, the days were long and the winters longer. Children huddled together for warmth, for stories, for memories they barely held. But even there, care found a way. Once a week, when the sun shone or the fire burned strong, Sister Merrill would call them in. "Time for the bath, little ones," she would whisper. And though it meant cold floors and bare toes, the children smiled. For the bath meant kindness. The water was heated in great kettles, poured into the big wooden tub in the corner. They went into at a time smallest first. Soap was made from herbs and ash, and though it stung the eyes, it smelled of rosemary and something like home. Sister Merrill would scrub gently. Behind ears, under nails, between fingers. Not quickly, but carefully, as if each child was only one. Then came the rinsing, the drying with coarse but warm cloths, the combing of hair. Afterward, they were wrapped in their cleanest shifts. Sometimes they were given bread. Sometimes a sweet root. Always a kiss to the forehead. They would sleep deeper that night. Their skin warm, their hair soft, their spirits lightened not just by water, but by being seen, touched gently, remembered. In a world where they had little, a bath was everything. And as the fire crackled low, and the basin steamed empty in the moonlight, Sister Merrill folded each damp cloth with care. Because to wash a child was to believe they mattered. And that belief could carry them through anything. The candlemaker's hands and the cleansing of wax and soot. In a narrow stone house, tucked between the chapel and the stables, lived the candlemaker. His fingers were always speckled with tallow, his sleeves stiff from splashes of wax, and the air in his home carried the gentle scent of beeswax and smoke. By day, he worked in heat and shadow, dipping long wicks again and again, shaping candles for churches, homes, and inns. But each evening, as dusk folded over the town, he stepped away from the vats. He washed, not for vanity, not even for comfort, but to peel away the soot of fire and the stick of wax, to remind himself there was skin beneath the layers. His basin stood on a carved wooden stool, and beside it, a jug of warmed rainwater. He poured it slowly, watching the steam curl like a blessing into the air. His hands, worn and scarred from years of shaping light, trembled slightly as he rubbed them clean. First the fingers stained with dye and smoke. Then the forearms, rough from holding iron ladles. Then the face. He used soap made from the fat he didn't need for candles. Mixed with mint or sage, it left behind a sharp, green scent. And when his arms were clean, he would sit by the window and rub oil into his palms, oil pressed from nuts by the village widow, traded for candles. His hands, which worked so hard to bring light into others' homes, were allowed this one moment of stillness, of warmth out of quiet. He would light one of his own candles, never the biggest, just a modest stub, and place it beside his window. A small glow to honor his day. And as it flickered, he would close his eyes and know that he too was more than his labor. He was warm. He was clean. And the darkness outside could wait until morning. The bathhouse beneath the pines and the whispering steam. At the edge of the forest, where the pines grew thick and tall, there stood a public bathhouse made of heavy timber and moss-covered stone. It was a rare luxury in a rural land, kept by a quiet couple who tended the fire and carried water from the spring. Travelers, woodsmen, and weary villagers came here not for gossip or merriment, but for stillness. Inside, the air shimmered with heat. Steam curled around beams and settled on the wooden floor in soft droplets. The great copper cauldron sang over the fire, and the scent of pine needles and birch oil soaked the walls. Each visitor bathed in silence. There was no rushing, no boasting. Only the slow sound of water being poured, the soft splash of cloth on skin. The old man who managed the door offered a towel and a nod. The woman beside the fire stirred herbs into the water, of yarrow for aches, marjoram for the lungs, and a sprig of spruce for spirit. One by one, people undressed, stepping carefully into the warm pools. The forest was close outside, but in here, it might as well have been another world. The heat soothed muscles long hardened by labor. The steam opened chests that had coughed through many winters. Some leaned back, letting the wooden walls support them as they drifted into dreams. When they emerged, red-cheeked and wrapped in clean cloth, they left quietly. No words were needed. Their steps were lighter. Their breath deeper. Their minds slower. The bathhouse did not judge, did not rush, did not forget. It was a sanctuary, not of stone or scripture, but of water and warmth. And for those who entered it, even just once, it remained in memory as a place where the world grew gentle again. The quiet queen and the chamber of evening oils. High in a castle surrounded by winter wind and courtly silence, lived a queen known not for jewels or war, but for quiet grace. Each evening, after the hall emptied and the day was folded away, she retired to her chamber not to sleep, but to cleanse. The chamber was lit with candles, their flames reflected in polished brass mirrors. Attendants whispered and moved softly, but the queen dismissed them with a nod. This was her time, her hour of stillness. The water was brought in silver basins, warmed with rose petals and a single drop of neroli oil. She dipped her hands, slowly, pressing each wrist to the side of the basin, letting the warmth crawl up her arms like a tender sigh. Her skin had weathered the years, the weight of crowns and courtly masks. Now, in the stillness of this room, she was simply a woman with tired shoulders and a longing for softness. She washed her face with cloths of fine linen, once woven by nuns in a convent far to the south. Her hair was brushed with ivory combs, long and methodical strokes that left it gleaming like silver threads. Then came the oils of almond, rosehip, and a drop of frankincense massaged into hands, temples, feet. Each sent a memory. Each movement a promise that she still ruled this one space, her own body. She would sit by the window afterward, cloaked in linen and quiet, watching the stars blink through winter clouds. No crown on her head. No council to summon. Only the hush of evening. And when at last she lay down to sleep, the room still held the fragrance of her ritual. Even the stones seemed softened by it. For though she ruled lands, armies, and men, she ruled first and always the sanctuary of her own stillness. bathed, balanced, at peace. The monastic silence and the ritual of cold water. Behind walls of ivy-covered stone, where bells echoed not for men but for God, the monks lived in silence, in stillness, in sacred rhythm. And among all their vows of poverty, chastity, obedience, there was another, and spoken yet enduring, the vow of cleansing. Each morning, before dawn pulled its pale light across the cloisters, the monks gathered at a carved stone basin nestled in the center of their courtyard. Spring water trickled into it year-round, even in the frost of midwinter. A quiet, constant stream, like the breath of the world itself. One by one, barefoot and wordless, the brothers stepped forward. They dipped their hands into the icy water, pressing it to their foreheads, their wrists, the back of their necks. It was not for vanity, not even for comfort, but to greet the day with presence, to wash away the heaviness of sleep, the remnants of thought, the subtle stains of ego. The cold bit their skin, but woke something deep within: clarity, humility, gentleness. Some monks would rub a few drops of lavender oil into their palms afterward, or mint from the garden. Just enough to carry a quiet fragrance into the work of the day, whether tending vines, copying psalms, or standing long hours in prayer. They spoke little, but their hands were clean, and their silence was radiant. For the water had touched more than flesh. It had brushed the edge of soul, the pilgrim's feet, and the dust of holy roads. He walked through cities and farmlands, by rivers and through woods, across bridges carved long ago by forgotten hands. He was a pilgrim not for penance or pen, but for purpose. On his back a pack, in his hand a wooden staff, on his feet cracked leather shoes torn by time and stone. But most of all, he carried dust. Dust of chapel floors, dust of roadside prayers, dust of blessings whispered in languages he could not name. And when he reached a monastery, an inn, or even a humble cottage, his first request was not for bread or a bed, but for water. He would kneel beside a basin, or sometimes a wooden bowl, and slowly, reverently, wash his feet. The water turned gray with the day's journey, but it was never wasted. He washed the spaces between his toes, the short curves of his heels, the arches that carried miles of hope. And then he'd dry them by the fire, pressing warmth into the tired bones. Sometimes, if fortune allowed, he'd rub in a balm of juniper or pine resin. And when he lay down to rest, wrapped in wool or straw, he would sleep not just as a traveler, but as a man whose feet had touched holy ground. Clean feet, quiet dreams, and a path waiting for morning. The village elder and the last well of summer. In a village where rooftops were softened with moss, and the smoke from chimneys drifted like old lullabies into the sky, lived the elder. Everyone knew him. Children knew him for his stories. Farmers knew him for his wisdom. And the old ones, they knew him as the one who stayed. Each morning, he walked slowly, leaning on a cane to the village well. Not to draw water himself. His hands had grown weak, his back bent from years. But he sat beside it on a small stool carved from oak, watching, listening, waiting. When someone filled a bucket, a boy, a mother, a passerby, he would ask for just one bowl. Not to drink, but to wash. He would dip his long fingers into the bowl, one by one, rinse his palms, pat his weathered face. The skin was thin now, like parchment, creased and delicate. But the water didn't judge. As it ran over his knuckles, he remembered bathing his children when they were small, being washed by his wife on fevered nights, and long before that, his own mother washing his face by candlelight. Water connected the chapters of his life. And here, in the soft edge of age, it reminded him that life had not been only toil. There had been gentleness. There had been care. Afterward, he would rub thyme and beeswax into his hands, warming the balm with his breath. He would sit, not speaking, letting the sun fall gently over his shoulders. And sometimes, if the wind was just right, He would hum a song that no one else remembered. A song about wells and days. And the way water knows all things, even how to soothe a man made of memory. The midwife's hands and the sacred cloth. In a quiet cottage near the edge of a forest, where there always smelled of thyme and milk, there lived a midwife. She had helped birth more children than she could count. She had been there at beginnings and sometimes at quiet endings. Her hands were strong, not because they had lifted heavy loads, but because they had held life itself. Before each birth, she followed a ritual passed down through generations. She would warm water over the hearth, slow and steady. Into the basin, she would place a clean linen cloth, one she had woven herself, months before, just for this moment. The cloth was soft, soaked with heat, and smelled of rosemary. She washed her hands slowly, fingers first, then wrists, palms, and the space beneath each nail. She did it not just to keep sickness away, but to greet the new soul with care. Clean hands. Clean cloth. Clean breath. The room might have been dark, the straw floor uneven, the air thick with pain and prayers, but when the baby came, the first thing it felt was warmth. Not cold steel. Not sharp wind. But a hand, a cloth. And water that had known waiting. Afterward, when the child cried and the mother wept, the midwife washed again. She sat by the fire, soaking her hands one more time, not because they were dirty, but because they had touched something sacred. And so, her hands rested in silence, cradled in warm water, as if to remind the world cleanliness was not just of the body, but of the heart that served it. The candle maker and the soot of solitude. In a narrow stone house behind the abbey, the candle maker lived alone. His days were long, and they smelled of beeswax and smoke. He stirred the melted wax in great vats, dipped wicks again and again, and lined his shelves with tiny towers of light waiting to be born. But candle making was a dirty craft. The soot clung to his fingers. His nails turned black with ash. His apron was stiff with wax. So, at the end of each day, he had a ritual. He would fetch a small pail of water from the stream just beyond the hill. Into it, he poured a few drops of vinegar, a handful of lavender, and a slice of lemon, if he had one. This was his wash. His private, quiet cleansing. He would sit at his workbench, roll up his sleeves, and lower his hands into the basin. And for a few long moments, he would do nothing but soak. Let the soot loosen. Let the warmth settle into his bones. Let the scent climb into the corners of the room. Then he would take a wooden brush, scrub gently, rinse, and repeat. Not out of vanity, no visitors ever came. Not out of piety, he rarely went to chapel. But because the wax he poured each day deserved clean hands. Because light, he believed, should be born from something pure. And though no one ever asked, the candles he made burned longer than most. And always, at their center, was the memory of water. The little girl who loved rain. In a small village where the roofs leaked and the paths turned to rivers in spring, lived a little girl who loved the rain. She loved it not for the puddles, though she splashed in those too. Not for the thunder, though she counted the seconds after each flash. She loved the rain because it was the only bath she could trust. Her family had little. A bucket here, a rat there. Once a week, if the hearth was burning strong, her mother would heat a pot and call her in. But most days, it was just cold cloth on cold skin. Except when it rained. Then she would run outside barefoot, arms stretched, face turned upward, letting the sky do the washing. Her hair would flatten against her cheeks. Her feet would turn to mud. Her eyes would close, and she would smile. She would pretend that the rain had names, that each drop whispered a secret as it slid down her nose. Kindness, one might say. Hope, said another. Peace. She would spin slowly, like a dancer. And when she was soaked through, chilled, joyful, glowing, she would run inside, wrap herself in a thick linen sheet, and curl up by the fire. Her mother never scolded. She only smiled and combed the girl's wet hair with her fingers. Rain never hurt a soul, she would say. And in that home of cracked beams and damp walls, a kind of cleanness lived, one not measured by soap, but by joy, the weaver's basin and the dust of looms. In the far corner of a quiet village, there lived a weaver whose loom never slept. Day after day, the rhythmic clatter of wooden beams echoed softly from her window, a lullaby made of thread and patience. Her fingers were always coated in dust to soft flakes from wool, tiny clouds of flax, 1,000 invisible fibers. It clung to her knuckles, settled under her nails, painted her palms a pale gray. No matter how fine the fabric she made, she wore the cost of its making. But each night, when the sun began to dip behind the hayfields, she performed a simple ceremony. She filled a wide basin with warm water, drawn from the well behind her cottage. Sometimes she added crushed mint leaves. Sometimes dried rose petals. Sometimes nothing at all, just water, quiet and honest. She sat at her stool, slipped her hands beneath the surface, and let them rest there. Motionless, grateful. The water turned cloudy within seconds, but the weaver did not mind. She would whisper to herself stories as she soaked with fabrics once made for a wedding, of cloth spun for a newborn's blanket, of a shawl woven in silence for a widow in winter. And as she washed, she remembered each one, not for their beauty, but for the hands that touched them. When she dried her fingers, they were not smooth. The calluses remained, but they were clean. And clean hands, she believed, gave kinder dreams. So she lay down, every night, not in a grand bed, but beneath a quilt stitched by her own hands that had worked, and then forgiven themselves. The shepherd and the stream below the hill. He lived in the hills, not in a house, but beneath the sky, with a cloak, a crook, and a dog by his side. His flock roamed freely, their bells ringing like wind chimes through the grass. He was alone, but never lonely. The sheep knew his voice. The wind carried his scent, and the earth remembered his steps. He rose with the mist, slept beneath stars, ate when the sheep were still. But there was one thing he did without fail. Every single morning, he bathed his hands and face in the stream that wound below his grazing hill. The water was cold, even in summer. It ran smooth over stones older than time. He would kneel at its edge, dip both hands into the current, and lift it to his face with reverence. The water rinsed away sleep, and dreams, and the long, silent conversations he had had with the sky during the night. Sometimes he would wash the dust from his feet, or run wet fingers through his tangled hair. Sometimes he said nothing, but the stream heard anyway. It became his mirror, his chapel, his quiet friend. He didn't own soap or perfumes, but he was cleaner than kings, because every drop that touched him had come from somewhere honest. And when he returned to his sheep, with wine-chapped cheeks and wet hands, he carried a kind of purity no crown could offer. The old woman and the rain barrel. In the last cottage before the forest began, lived a woman with a back bent by time, but eyes that still sparkled with mischief. She had once been a cook for a manor house, then a nanny, then a widow. Now she lived alone, with a cat named Butter and a rain barrel by her door. She had no servants, no hearth large enough to heat bath water, but she kept clean in her own quiet way. After every rainfall, she'd step outside, slow but certain, and lift the wooden lid from her barrel. She'd dip in a tin ladle, fill a basin, and bring it inside. The water was always cold, sometimes sweet with leaves, sometimes clear as glass. She would set it on her table, roll up her sleeves, and begin her evening wash. Hands first, then face, then neck, then, on occasion, even her feet, if the cat wasn't curled in her lap. She used a cloth made from an old shirt. No scent, no soap. Just water, patience, and memory. She said the rain carried stories from the clouds, and that if you listened closely, You could hear bits of lullabies from other lands, echoing in the splash of a basin. When she finished, she would light a candle, wrap herself in a shawl that still smelled of thyme, and hum to herself as she brushed her silver hair. And though she lived alone, no one who passed her garden gate ever doubted. Here was a woman who remembered how to care for things, even the smallest rituals, even herself. The bathhouse keeper's secret piece. Tucked behind the town square, just past the baker's alley and the shoemaker's wall, stood an old public bathhouse. Its door was worn smooth by generations of hands. Its walls echoed not with laughter, but with the hush of steam and whispers. The keeper of this bathhouse was a quiet man with silver streaks in his beard. He had once been a soldier, then a farrier, but he found his peace here in the smell of hot water, wet stone, and herbs steeping in copper pots. Each morning before sunrise, before the first guest arrived, he would open the windows, stoke the fire under the water tank, and prepare the baths. He scattered mint leaves and dried sage into the corners, and let the steam bloom like breath rising from the earth. But before anyone stepped into the chamber, he always performed a private ritual. He would kneel by the smallest tub, a little one, used rarely, and pour water from a ladle over his own hands. Then his wrists. Then the back of his neck. Then, gently, his heart. No one ever saw this. No one ever asked. But he did it all the same. Because he believed that to serve cleanliness, one must enter clean. Later, he would scrub backs, carry towels, refill basins. He would listen to the quiet confessions of farmers, the soft weeping of widows, the tired sighs of merchants. The bathhouse was not just warm. It was forgiving. And that forgiveness began with a man and a ladle of water, who understood that hygiene was never just about the body, but about gentleness shared. The boy who polished the monk's shoes. In the stone corridors of an ancient monastery, where candles flickered low and silence hung like mist, lived a boy named Elias. He was not a monk, not yet. He was the boy who cleaned their shoes. Each night, as the brothers finished prayers and meals and settled into their chambers, Elias would walk quietly from room to room, collecting their sandals, boots, and slippers. Some were caked with mud. Others smelled of fields or firewood. All were signs of a life lived in quiet duty. Elias took them to the little room behind the kitchen, a place lit by a single oil lamp, always warm with the scent of wax and lye. There, he had his tools, a cloth, a brush, and a bowl of warm water with thyme floating on the surface. He would wash the shoes carefully, not to make them shine, but to make them ready. He believed that clean shoes meant clean paths. That even a monk, walking in silence to prayer, deserved to step on stone with care beneath him. He would dip his cloth, wring it just so, and press gently over each leather surface. He would whisper little prayers not for himself, but for the feet that would wear them. When he was done, he lined them up along the corridor wall, perfectly spaced. No one ever thanked him. No one had to. Because every brother who slipped into those soft, clean shoes in the dark morning hours felt something small and good beneath them, as if their journey began not in their thoughts, but in the hands of a boy who believed in walking well. The woman who washed her sorrows in milk. In a wooden house with shutters always half closed, there lived a woman with tired eyes and kind hands. She had lost much: a child in the fever, a husband in the war, a sister to silence. She didn't speak much, but the neighbors said she always smelled of warm bread and lavender. She kept to herself, mostly, tended a small garden, fed stray cats, and every week, on the evening of the quietest day, she would wash her face with milk. She didn't do this out of vanity. There were no mirrors in her house. She did it because it made her feel soft again. She would heat the milk just enough to be warm, not scalding. Then add crushed chamomile flowers, stir with a wooden spoon, and pour it into a clay bowl. She'd take a strip of linen, soak it gently, and press it against her face, closed eyes, cheeks, lips, neck. And as the warmth touched her skin, she would remember softness. The baby she once held. The kiss she once gave. The words she once whispered in the dark. The milk wasn't magic. It couldn't bring anyone back. But it reminded her that her skin still breathed, her body still lived, and she was still worth touching gently. When she finished, she would dry her face with a towel she had embroidered long ago, and place the bowl by the window, so the cats might drink what she did not use. And in that gesture, quiet, private, and loving, she found a kind of cleanness that no water could give. A healing that didn't fix, but forgave. The candle maker and the soap that sang. In the bend of a cobbled road near the abbey, there was a narrow shop with no sign. Only a soft scent floated from its window, wax oil, and something else, something like lavender caught in the rain. The woman who lived there made candles by day and soap by night. She rarely spoke, but her hands, always warm with oil and ash, told every story she needed to tell. Her soaps were not carved or fancy. They were rough blocks, square like bread loaves, colored pale green, ivory, or sometimes amber. But they sang when touched by water. Not a melody of notes, but a melody of memory. For each bar she made carried a scent tied to a time: chamomile for childhood, rosemary for morning, honey for forgiveness. She washed with them only once a week, after sundown on Sundays. She would light a small candle, not one for sale, but one she made only for herself. Then fill a basin with warm water, and unwrap the soap she had saved for that night. She would lather slowly, not to scrub away, but to remember. Each motion a pause, each rinse a kindness. And when the soap began to melt in her palm, she would whisper to it, as if it carried a part of her into the drain: a sorrow, a joy, a secret. When she finished, she wrapped the soap in cloth again and placed it on the shelf. Not to dry, but to rest. Because even soap, she believed, needed to sleep after touching someone's heart. The gravedigger and the midnight rain. Far from the town square, beneath a sky full of unmarked stars, the gravedigger worked in silence. He didn't mind the dark. He didn't fear the stillness. He only feared forgetting to be kind. Each morning, he washed the dirt from his hands with cold water from the well. Each night, after lowering the last shovel, he stood at the edge of the newest grave and waited. For what? No one knew. He never said. But if the clouds were kind, the rain would come. He would take off his hat, bow his head, and let the rain wash over him, his face, his shoulders, his arms, his palms, still clutching the wooden handle of the spade. He never used soap, never owned a towel. But the rain knew how to cleanse. Not just dirt, but silence. Not just sweat, but sorrow. The rain whispered over the stones, soaked into the ground he had just turned, and ran down the back of his neck like a prayer. Some said he talked to the rain. Others said he simply listened. But all agreed, no one buried the dead with as much gentleness as he did. Because he never forgot the hands that buried must also be washed in something sacred, even if it came only from the sky. The mill girl and the river's edge. She worked from before dawn to just after dusk, turning wheels, lifting sacks, sorting grain. The air in the mill was thick with dust, with flour, with the hum of tired bodies. But she had a secret. Just beyond the mill's shadow, through a small opening in the brush, ran a narrow stream, clear, cold, fast. The river's edge was her chapel. Each evening, after her shift ended and the millstones slowed to rest, she would walk there in silence, carrying only a scrap of linen and a small cake of salt soap wrapped in leaves. She would kneel on a flat rock and lace her sleeves and dip her arms in. The water shocked her skin at first, a sudden gasp, but then, slowly, it brought relief. It carried away the powder from her wrists, the ache from her elbows, the quiet weight of labor. She washed her arms, her face, the back of her neck. Then she would close her eyes and whisper to the water, "Take what does not belong to me." The stream never answered in words, but it always listened. It always carried something away. Afterward, she would shake out her linen, rewrap her soap, and walked back through the grass, her arms still damp, her mind lighter. No one ever saw her. No one ever asked why her skin smelled of salt and wind. But those who worked beside her often said, "She smiles like someone who has just touched the sky." And perhaps she had. The knight who bathed before battle, before the sun had risen, before the banners were raised or the war horns sounded, one night stood barefoot in the dew-soaked grass, beside a basin of still water. His armor lay in pieces on the stones, pauldrons, greaves, gauntlets, breastplate waiting. The sword remained in its scabbard. The shield leaned quietly against a tree. The knight knelt. He was not praying. He was washing. He dipped a cloth into the cold water and wiped his face. Then his hands. Then the inside of his wrists. He did not rush. He did not tremble. He had done this before every battle, for years. Others polished steel. He cleansed skin. Because he believed that if his body was clean, his mind would be still. And if his mind was still, his hand would not shake. He whispered to the water. Not for victory, but for clarity. Not for glory, but for return. Then he stood, piece by piece dressed himself in iron, and when he looked at his reflection in the basin, his eyes were calm. The others thought him superstitious. Perhaps he was. But he always came back. And when he did, he always returned to the water again. To wash off not just dirt, but memory. The queen and the linen of forgiveness. In the highest room of the keep, where windows were small and the air held the hush of perfume and parchment, a queen sat at a washstand of carved oak. She was not old, nor young, but her face carried the lines of worry etched gently with years of rule. Each night, after the chambermaids had gone, she would unpin her hair, remove her crown, and sit alone. She had a drawer of linens a dozens, neatly folded, each one used only once. She would choose one, dip it in rose water warmed beside the fire, and press it to her face. Not just to cleanse, but to release. Each cloth held the weight of the day. A difficult decision. A letter from the east. A lie told kindly. A truth spoken too late. She never used a linen. When the night was over, she placed it in a wooden box and closed the lid gently. Some believed she was vain. She was not. She knew that ruling left residue, and that to lead others, she had to first forgive herself. And so, each night, she offered forgiveness to her own reflection, through water, through cloth, through quiet. The castle slept, and so did she, a skin soft, heart lighter, cleansed not only by water, but by grace. The shepherd's last bath. High in the hills, where the winds whispered through the grass and the stars came early, an old shepherd lived in a stone hut with no door. His flock had grown small. His beard had grown long, and his bones creaked with every morning. But he was content. He had lived many winters, seen wolves and comets, plagues and springs. And now, he felt his time was near. So, one morning, he carried his old copper basin out to the stream. The same basin he'd used for 50 years. It was dented. The handle had broken, but it still held water. He filled it, carried it carefully back, set it beside his hut. He stripped to his skin. The sun was low and gold, the wind kind, and slowly, reverently, he bathed. He washed his feet, dusty from the paths, his arms, strong though thin, his chest, where time had carved its lines. He hummed as he did so a melody no one had heard in years. Then he dried with a woolen cloth, sat on a stone, and watched the sheep wander. That night, he slept without pain, without dreams. Only the sound of wind and the memory of water. And when the morning came, and the villagers found him still, they said he looked clean, not just in body, but in peace. They buried him in linen. the same kind he once used to dry the water from his face. And the basin was left at the stream, where it caught the rain, and waited for someone else who understood that the cleanest soul is one who remembers to wash before goodbye. The baker and the ritual of flour and steam. Long before the roosters called to the dawn, the baker was awake. Not just to knead or fire the oven, but to cleanse. The flour covered everything in his life, his sleeves, his lashes, the wrinkles on his knuckles. It clung like memory, like snow. But before he baked, he washed. Behind the bakery, under a crooked wooden arch, stood a little tub carved from old pine. He'd fill it with water warmed from last night's fire. And into it, he would step barefoot. Steam rose like breath from the basin. He would sit on a stool and wash slowly, rubbing his hands with soap made from ash and lard, rinsing his arms to the elbow, rubbing beneath his nails with a sliver of bone. He didn't speak. He didn't hum. He only listened, to the crackle of the coals, to the shifting of the dough left rising inside, to his own breath, steady as the rise of bread. Then, clean and quiet, he would dust his palms with flour not to soil, but to begin. Because to him, baking was not only feeding. It was a form of worship. And no one should pray with dirty hands. The pilgrims paused at the healing spring. She had walked for weeks. Through rain, through stone villages, through forests that whispered and hills that moaned. Her feet bled. Her skin burned where the sun had touched it too long. Her hair was tangled with wind and dust. But still she walked out toward the spring. It was no grand place. Just a small trickle of water, hidden behind a mossy rock near an abandoned chapel. No shrine, no icon. Only water, running over time-smooth stone. She had heard of it in a whisper. A place where travelers did not simply drink, but remember how to stop. She knelt, removed her shoes, and wrapped the cloth around her fingers. Then she cupped the spring water in her hands. It was cold enough to startle, but sweet enough to forgive. She washed her face first, then her feet. Then she let it run across her arms and down her shoulders. There were no chants, no offerings, just the quiet trickle, and her body returning to stillness. When she left the pain behind. Not because it had gone, but because the water had given her a place to set it down. And she walked on lighter, not cleaner perhaps, but cared for. The weaver and the scent of lavender smoke. She lived alone, where the woods met the fields, in a cottage that always smelled of wool and fire. Her fingers worked endlessly through thread and loom, but at dusk, every day without fail, she washed. Not for others. No one came. Not for vanity. Her mirrors were cracked and dusty. But because the rhythm of weaving deserved a counter-rhythm, that of water, warmth, and rest. Her bath was no more than a barrel, lined with cloth, filled from the well, heated with stones pulled from the fire. She added a handful of dried lavender, crumbled between her palms. And as the petals swirled and softened, she breathed them in. Then she bathed. With a sponge of moss tied in twine, she cleaned the threads of her arms, the small of her back where the loom stool pressed all day, the curve of her spine that bent over each warp and weft. Sometimes she whispered names to the water. Names of those long past. Names of those she missed. Other times, she said nothing at all, letting the scent of lavender smoke and the heat of the stones do all the speaking. Afterward, wrapped in linen, she would sit by the fire, her hair damp, her breath soft, and fall asleep before the flames had time to fade. The ink-stained monk and the midnight basin. In the silence of stone walls and candlelight, a monk sat hunched over parchment, his fingers blackened with ink, his sleeves heavy with the dust of vellum. All day, he copied ancient words. Names of saints. Stories of rain and angels. Psalms written before his own grandfather was born. He lived in silence, but his world was full of birds in the cloister, of bells in the tower, of scripture in his head like lullabies. When the candles burned low, he would push aside the inkpot, close the heavy book, and rise. He did not sleep yet. He walked the hallway barefoot, his sandals placed neatly by the bench. In a chamber no larger than a cupboard waited his basin and water, cool as slate, still as a prayer. He rolled his sleeves, washed each finger, each palm, watched the ink dissolve like words returning to silence. He washed his face to dot slowly, as if the water carried memory. Some monks feared the cold. He welcomed it. It reminded him he was real. Not just a scribe of ancient thoughts, but a living man, awake in the night, gentle with his hands. Then he dried them on linen, folded it, and bowed. To the water, to the quiet, to the soft pause before dreams. The candlemaker's soot and soap. Her fingers always smelled of tallow. She shaped light for a living, long tapers for the chapel, fat ones for kitchens, little stubs for children afraid of the dark. The workshop was warm, thick with scent, melted wax, bees, ash, and old cloth. She wore a dark apron, a kerchief tied tight to keep the smoke from her hair. She whistled as she worked. But each evening, when the sun kissed the sill, she cleaned herself as carefully as she made her candles. Behind her cottage, there stood a barrel. Next to it, a bar of soap made from her own hands. Lye fat, and a pinch of dried lemon peel. Not luxurious, but hers. She poured water from the kettle, steamed her face first, then her arms, then her chest. The soot left trails down her skin, but she smiled at it. It meant she had worked well, that she had brought light to someone's supper, or a widow's window, or a prayer offered in the dark. She always whispered as she washed out sorrow, out fire. In peace, she believed the body had to forget its labor before the soul could rest. Then, wrapped in a shawl that smelled faintly of rosemary, she lay by the window, a single candle burning low beside her bed, its glow no longer her task, but her companion into dreams. The cobbler and the rainwater jar. He lived in a crooked house at the edge of the village, where the road turned to forest. His hands were wide, his nails flat, his palms cracked from decades of leather and pitch. He had made boots for soldiers, shoes for dancers, slippers for children who cried at night. He never charged the poor, never kept his scraps, never let a single boot leave his bench unpolished. But what few knew was that he loved rain more than anything. Each storm, he'd place out 6 jars, old clay things with chipped rims. He collected rainwater like a man saves silver, for cleaning, not drinking, because nothing, he said, was softer than water from the sky. Every Sunday evening, he would carry a jar inside, pour it into a copper bowl, strip to his undershirt, and wash face, neck, chest, arms. And, most sacred of all, his feet. The same feet that stood all day in dust and silence. The rain knew how to listen. The rain, he thought, understood leather. When he was done, he poured the rest of the water under the old tree outside. A thank you. Then he would light his lantern, place his tools in a line, and sleep with the sound of faraway thunder in his ears. The shepherd and the moonlit pool. Far from towns and cobbled paths, he lived among sheep and wind. A quiet man, with a staff as old as his memories, and a cloak that smelled of wool and fire. Each day he walked, over mossy hills, across streams that sang their own names, watching the sky like a timekeeper. The sheep were not just animals to him, they were his choir, his silence, his family. But when the moon was full, and the sky opened wide with stars, he walked alone to the hidden pool. It lay behind a crescent of rocks, fed by a spring that bubbled from beneath the hillside. The sheep would not follow. They knew it was his time. There, in still water lit by silver light, he undressed. Not quickly, with reverence. He stepped in. The cold was sharp at first, but then it held him. He washed slowly and not to remove dirt, but to honor the day. Each part of him had walked, watched, protected. Now each part was soothed. He dipped his hands, poured water down his shoulders, over his chest, his arms, his legs. He whispered a few words, not prayers, but thanks. Then he sat in the shallows, watching the moon ripple across the water. When he rose, he left no footprints. He returned warm, though the night was cold. And the sheet, without waking, shifted slightly, as if sensing he'd come back clean and whole. The washerwoman's evening grace. She washed for the whole village. For those who paid her, and for those who never could. She carried heavy bundles, scrubbed over the washboard until her knuckles bled, boiled linens in great iron pots that hissed and steamed like dragons. Her fingers were always pruned. Her back ached. But her eyes were kind. And every evening, when the last cloth was hung, when the steam had lifted into the rafters, she did something small but sacred. She filled a wooden bowl. With the last water from the pot still warm, softened with herbs, lavender or mint if she had any left. She sat by the hearth and wrapped her hands, removed her shoes, and with the same tenderness she gave others, she washed herself. Her feet first. They had walked far. Then her hands. They had served many. She never hurried. No one waited. This time was hers. She hummed softly, the lullaby once sung to her as a child. Or perhaps one she made up just now. The words didn't matter. Only the rhythm. After, she would sit in the same chair, wrap her feet in a woolen cloth, and close her eyes, while the night gathered gently around her like folded linen. The mill keeper's secret wash. The mill was loud by day, wheels turning, grain pouring, water pounding the stones. But by dusk, when the last sacks were tied shut and the workers had gone, he stayed. He was not just keeper of flour and stone. He was guardian of the stream. Behind the mill, where the channel ran quieter, there was a little ledge, carved by time, where he kept a basin no one else knew. It was old, worn smooth, and always filled with fresh water that flowed but never spilled. He used it every night. He washed the flour from his arms, the dust from his eyelashes, the powder from his neck. Each gesture was slow, like turning pages in an old book. Sometimes, a bird would land nearby. Sometimes, a fish would leap. Sometimes, nothing happened at all. But he always smiled, because even when the world was silent, the water remembered him. He'd never told anyone about this basin. Not out of pride, but out of love. Some places are meant to stay quiet, so their magic doesn't dissolve in words. When he returned inside, the mill seemed softer, as if it too had been bathed. And when he lay on his cot, hands still damp, he dreamed not of grain or gold, but of water gently cupping his face, like the earth itself saying, "You've done enough. Rest now." The midwife and the sacred basin. She was known by many names: healer, wise woman, mother of mothers. Her hands had caught more lives than any priest had blessed. They were small, but strong, capable of both stitching and soothing, of holding pain and offering peace. By day, she moved swiftly through the village carrying linen bundles, herbs wrapped in twine, and a tiny bell that chimed like birdsong as she walked. She had seen birth in barns, in kitchens, on dirt floors, beneath stormy skies. But always, after the child was safe and the mother was resting, she asked for a bowl. Somewhere quiet, somewhere calm. A basin of clean water, even if it had to be drawn from a frozen well. She would sit, roll up her sleeves, and wash. Not out of vanity, but reverence. She washed the places the child had touched, her fingers, her arms, sometimes her whole chest. She washed with eyes closed. She whispered words known only to her. And sometimes, when alone, she would add a single drop of lavender oil. not for luxury, but for memory, so that her hands, when holding the next new life, would still carry the scent of calm. Later, wrapped in wool and dreams, she would sleep sitting up, ready to be woken again. But for a few moments, as the water cooled beside her, she belonged only to herself. Clean, strong, whole. The orphan boy and the tin cup bath. He had no mother, no father, no bed of his own. But he had a place under the stairs, a thin blanket, and a little tin cup. Each night, after the castle's kitchen fires burned low, he would sneak to the barrel where water was kept for morning stew. He didn't take much, only enough to fill his cup. He'd carry it carefully, two hands wrapped tight, to his corner. He had found a cracked dish once, and used it like a basin. It wobbled, but it held. He'd pour the cupful into the dish, dip a rag, and wash. First his face round, pale, often smudged with ash. Then his arms, then his feet. Sometimes the water was icy. Sometimes it had leaves in it. But it was his. It made him feel new. After, he would dry himself with the corner of his shirt. Fold everything neatly. Hide the dish. Place the cup upside down like a treasure. And then curl up to sleep, wrapped in the silence of secret cleanliness. No one praised him. No one knew. But in his dreams, he sat at a table with knights. And he was clean. And he was seen. The widow, and the hearthside ritual. Her house was quiet now. The creak of wood, the slow tick of the pendulum clock, the hush of her own breath were her only companions. But she lived gently. She baked bread each morning, swept the floor twice a day, fed the birds even in winter. And each evening, as the sun turned the windows gold, she performed the same small ceremony, not out of habit, but of love. A kettle over the fire. A basin beside her chair. A cloth, folded from her wedding linen. She did not need to scrub. Only to warm her skin. To remember that her body was still hers. She dipped the cloth into the steaming water, squeezed it, and placed it over her face. The warmth made her sigh. It reminded her of her mother's lap, of lullabies, of slow Sundays long gone. Then she wiped her arms, her hands, her neck. She lit a single candle. And with soft, practiced fingers, combed her gray hair, braided it, and tucked it into a clean scarf. Then, in her clean nightdress, she sat by the hearth with a cup of milk and honey. Outside, the wind rustled the ivy. Inside, she glowed. And when she finally lay down, she whispered, "Tomorrow, I will wake clean again." And so she did. The candlemaker's gentle hands. In a corner shop that smelled of wax and smoke, the candlemaker worked alone. Day after day, he dipped wick after wick into hot tallow, slowly building light. The air inside was always thick. The walls were soot like a winter coat. His hands, cracked and yellowed, bore the scent of grease and flame. But each evening, when the sun dipped behind the chimney, he laid down his ladle, blew out the last candle, and turned to his quiet ritual. A bucket of water waited by the door. Cold, often darkened with soot. But beside it, always, a single cloth, clean and folded. He would wash without rush, as though in making the day. He dipped the cloth, wrung it gently, and rubbed it slowly over his palms. Then his wrists. Then his arms, all the way up. Wax curled from his skin. Fat dissolved under fingertips. He washed until his hands no longer smelled like work, but like nothing, like sleep. When he finished, he lit a single fresh candle from the very batch he'd made that day. And in its golden flicker, he would sit in silence, cradling a bowl of barley stew. Clean, if only just his hands. Quiet, if only just the room. But enough. And enough is sometimes everything. The maidservant's rainwater morning. She awoke before the sky brightened. In the great house she served, no one called her by name. But she moved with a grace that needed no recognition. Before polishing boots, before beating rugs, Before fetching water for her mistress's tea, she had her own moment. Outside the servants' quarters, under the overhang of old thatch, she kept a clay bowl. Each night, if rain came, the bowl filled cool silent pure. On mornings when the bowl glistened with rainwater, she would slip out barefoot, even in frost, and lift it carefully. She'd kneel on the stone, dip her fingers in, and bring the water to her face. Once to her forehead. Once to each cheek. Once to her heart. No scrubbing. No soap. Just presence. A morning baptism of sorts. She whispered no prayer, but her breath in the cold air looked like one. The others never noticed. The masters never knew. But each time she scrubbed their linen, carried their trays, stood silently while they passed, she had already claimed the morning as her own. The old monk and the steam cellar. Beneath the monastery, below rows of books, under chants and bells and cloisters, there was a stone-walled chamber, where warmth lived. The monks called it simply the cellar. But to Brother Ulrich, it was something more. There, once a week, steam rose from a copper cauldron, brought to boil by logs blessed with rosemary and pine. And once a week, he would descend, alone. He disrobed not out of shame, but with calm reverence, as one removes the weight of the world. He sat on the smooth bench, closed his eyes, and breathed. The heat opened his pores, but more than that, it softened the stiff edges of his thoughts. Sweat ran down his brow. He did not wipe it. It was his body speaking after 6 days of silence. Then came the washing. Not hurried. A basin of warm water stood nearby. He dipped a cloth, rubbed his arms in long, slow strokes, his feet, his chest. The water darkened. The room smelled of old herbs and clean stone. And he sang the single note, low and steady, like the hum of the earth. When he emerged, his robe was fresh. His breath was slower. His silence more generous. And the others, though they never asked, sensed that Brother Ulrich's peace came from deeper than prayer, from water, heat, and the sacred practice of letting the soul breathe through the skin. The shepherd's woolen basin. High in the hills, where the air was sharp, and the winds carried songs of the sky, a shepherd lived alone with his flock. His hut was small, round, and built from stone and sod, but inside it was warm with the breath of sheep and the softness of wool. He spent his days walking across ridges, through mist, listening to the sound of hooves and bells, watching the sky for signs. He had no mirror. No soap. No linen towels. But each evening, after the sheep were penned and the sun had lowered behind the distant pines, he would take his basin. It wasn't made of metal. It was a wide wooden bowl, lined with a thick ring of wool around the edges, not for cleaning, but for comfort. He'd stitch the wool himself, from his favorite lamb, long since gone. He would warm snowmelt over the fire, just enough to steam. Then he would sit cross-legged, pour the water into the bowl, and soak his hands. They were rough hands, calloused from brambles, stained from tending hooves and rubbing sops. But the water turned them tender again. He didn't rush. With his fingers submerged, he breathed deeply. Sometimes he hummed, a low tune known only to the mountains. Then he'd rub his forearms, his neck, his face. Eyes closed. And afterward, he'd dry himself on an old woolen square and whisper, "Still here," not for anyone to hear. Just to remind himself. Still here. Still clean. Still human. The candlelit washing of the bell ringer. At the edge of the village stood a squat stone church, its bell tower leaning slightly like a thoughtful elder. Inside that tower lived the bell ringer. His name was mostly forgotten. People simply called him the bell. He rang for weddings, for storms, for deaths. He rang when soldiers passed, when strangers arrived, and when the year turned. He didn't speak much. But every evening, after the final toll, he lit a single candle in his tower room. And there, in the soft light, he performed a ritual no one else knew. He took a tin pail of water, drawn earlier from the village well. He placed it near the fire until it lost its chill. Then he sat on a simple stool, pulled off his heavy boots, and slowly, carefully, washed his feet. They were old feet, tired, shaped by narrow stairs and cobbled roads. He washed them as if thanking them. He dried them with a cloth he kept only for this moment, a patched, fraying, but always clean. Then he would wash his hands, palms blackened by rope and iron. He moved slowly, like he was unwinding the day. Sometimes he'd whisper names into the water. Names of the dead. Names of the living. Names he couldn't forget. Then he'd pour the water outside the tower window, onto the grass below, where wild violets grew. And sleep would come quickly, carried on the memory of warm water and flickering light. The washerwoman's last hour. She lived near the river, close enough to hear its lullaby, far enough to avoid its floods. Every day, she washed for others, the butcher's aprons, the doctor's towels, the farmer's stained tunics. She scrubbed against rocks, rinsed in cold currents, hung heavy fabrics on lines between crooked trees. Her fingers were red year-round. Her back bent not from age, but from labor. But once a week, after sunset on the quietest evening, she washed for herself. She filled her copper pot with water, set it over her fire, and as it warmed, she laid out a simple cloth robe, woven from scraps, soft from age, clean from care. When the steam curled toward the ceiling, she poured the water into her largest basin. She added a pinch of crushed mint, gathered from the edge of her garden. Then she stood in the warmth of her home, removed her work clothes, and stepped in. The water barely reached her ankles. But that was enough. She scooped it with her hands, over her shoulders, over her arms, over her heart. She didn't speak. She didn't move quickly. She simply was. A woman alive in water. Alone, but whole. Afterward, she sat wrapped in a dry shawl, feet in wool socks, hair combed back. And for a full hour, before sleep took her, she belonged to no one's chore. Only to herself. Clean. Quiet. Enough. The village without a bathhouse. There was once a village so small, so far from roads and rivers, that it had no bathhouse, no well-stone wash basin, no steaming room where elders sat and sighed. But it had people. And where people are, rituals bloom like wildflowers. In that village, they washed not with grandeur, but with rhythm. Children were taught to dip cloth in morning dew, and wipe their faces before speaking. Old men scrubbed their palms with snow before taking bread. Mothers warmed rainwater in clay pots and pressed lavender into it, washing their babies with such care that even silence felt soft. They didn't speak of cleanliness. They had no word for hygiene. But they had a phrase, used often, and always with tenderness, like your hands match your heart. It wasn't about being free of dirt, it was about meeting the day with intention. And though no traveler ever stopped there, and no map carried its name, the people lived long, slept soundly, and passed into memory as those who washed gently, and with grace. The memory of soap. In a crumbling monastery, where ivy had overtaken the stone, a boy once found an old wooden box. Inside, wrapped in linen that had turned to threads, was something strange, a pale cube, hard and cracked, but scented faintly of herbs and oil. He brought it to the elder monk. The old man took it carefully, held it to his nose, and closed his eyes. "Soap," he whispered, as if naming a ghost. He explained that long ago, monks made such things from olive oil, ash, and lye. They would scent them with rosemary or juniper. Not for vanity, for sacredness. To clean before prayer. To wash before writing scripture. They made soap not to sell, but to remind their hands they were instruments of kindness. The boy asked if he could use it. The monk nodded. That night, the boy boiled water, found a clean bowl, and cut a sliver of the ancient bar. It melted slowly, releasing a scent of forgotten gardens. And as he washed his face, his hands, his arms, he felt something he couldn't name. Not just cleanliness. Not just warmth. But connection. To those who came before. To those who washed with reverence. to the idea that water and care might outlast even time. The final wash. One winter evening, when the wind sounded like an old lullaby, a woman sat beside a hearth, her hair streaked with silver, her eyes reflecting flame. She had washed many things in her life: clothes, faces, wounds, tears. She had lived through plagues, through war, through years when water was frozen for weeks. But tonight, she prepared for her final wash. Not for death, but for peace. She filled a small basin. She added thyme. She stirred it 3 times with her finger. And then she washed, not hurriedly, not for anyone else. Her hands, her face. Behind her ears. Between each toe. She dried herself with a piece of linen she'd kept since girlhood. Worn, frayed, loved. Then she wrapped herself in a blanket, lay by the fire, and let the warmth rise through her body. And as the snow drifted outside, and the wind whispered in the cracks of the door, she smiled. Because she had done it. She had washed gently. She had lived cleanly. She had remembered what the world forgets, that even when the world is dark, a warm bowl of water, cloth, and a quiet heart are enough to carry you through.